The hush arrived first. For 117 years, I had been Astropath Prime of the Sol system, my mind yoked to the throne's glare since the day ritual flames seared the Master's mark into living tissue. In that span, I had endured plague cycles and civil ruptures, heard worlds die in the warp like distant bells, felt the constant pressure of 10,000 souls reaching, begging, warning. Through it all, one thing never failed. The beacon. His presence. The Astronomicon, steady, unwavering. An impossible warmth that made the Imperium's madness navigable. It was my true north in a universe that had long since mislaid sanity. Then it stopped. There was no celestial drumbeat, no grand omen, no dramatic shudder of the cosmos to announce that the heart had ceased. I was seated in my sanctum beneath the Himalayan stone, monitoring the psychic traffic routed through Terra's orbital stations, when the change struck like a fist to the sternum. It wasn't pain. Pain would have been familiar. This was subtraction, an abrupt removal so total my nerves recoiled from it. The heat I'd carried behind my ribs for more than a century simply extinguished. In its place spread a cold that felt ancient, the kind that seeps into marrow on dead worlds where the sun has forgotten its duty. My augmetic fingers, replacements installed after a warp burn decades prior, shuddered on the console. The rune lattices showing channel activity fluttered once, twice, and collapsed into darkness. In a heartbeat, the invisible filaments that bound Terra to the Imperium snapped away, severed cleanly, as if an unseen blade had passed through the network. Instinct took me. I reached outward, flinging consciousness into the warp the way I had countless times, expecting turbulence, distortion, anything except what greeted me. The familiar currents were gone. The great ancient flow lines that had endured 10 millennia had dissolved. In their absence was something raw and feral, an ocean of unmasked emotion and unleashed force, a heaving riot of malice and hunger. Where the beacon should have been, there was nothing at all, no dim ember, no flicker, no wounded glow. Only the faint psychic afterimage of its existence, like the ghost of a star burned onto the inner eye. In that instant, the truth arrived with terrible clarity. The God Emperor of mankind, throne master, bulwark, salvation, chain upon the abyss, was dead. My first coherent thought was embarrassingly mundane. Should I file a report? The absurdity hit so hard it became laughter. Thin, hysterical, unearned. A sound that didn't belong in that sanctum. To whom? I heard myself whisper between broken breaths. The High Lords would be discovering it themselves within minutes. The Adeptus Astronomica had become a relic in the instant its purpose vanished. 1 trillion souls across the stars were about to learn that their god could die. The laughter curdled and died when the mountain trembled. Censors would have called it seismic, but it was not rock settling. It was deeper than geology. Something structural in reality bending under a new, unbearable load. For 10,000 years, a will like a star had braced the Imperium against the tides of the warp. His death hadn't merely snuffed out a light. It had removed a dam. I forced myself upright. My legs felt borrowed, untrustworthy. The sanctum walls, carved from living stone, consecrated with oils and prayers older than nations, seemed to pulse with a rhythm that did not belong to Terra. The blessed unguents that had held the darkness at arm's length for millennia began to smoke, their sanctity failing as the warp pressed closer to the skin of real space. Copper filled the air, and something else, an intangible taste that made my enhanced senses recoil. Finality, endings, futures that would never be permitted to exist. The first Vox transmission reached me minutes after the hush began. The voice belonged to the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, Valdor's successor, a man whose name slipped from my grasp as if memory itself had been struck numb. His tone was clipped, controlled yet edged with something he could not entirely bury. All stations. Code Omega event in progress. Maintain positions. Await orders. The throne room is sealed. No entry without my authorization. Code Omega, a phrase that had lived in sealed archives and whispered hypotheticals. So theoretical, many had stopped believing it had meaning. Now it crawled through the Vox with the weight of a funeral bell. More transmissions followed, stacking into a portrait of a civilization beginning to split along its own seams. The Imperial fists at Lion's Gate requested immediate reinforcement as riots erupted in the lower hive levels. The Administratum issued emergency rationing across the Sol system. Most troubling, the Adeptus Mechanicus began withdrawing priests from critical infrastructure, citing unforeseen complications within the machine spirits. I didn't need their euphemisms. Every blessed mechanism in the Imperium was feeling the Emperor's absence like the loss of a limb. Semi-sentient programs, centuries of sanctified logic and ritualized function, suddenly forced to reconcile a reality where the anchor of their theology had vanished. In that confusion was agony. In that agony, failure. Within hours, systems would begin to die not from sabotage or battle, but from despair written into code. The second tremor was stronger. This time, the sanctum showed it. Hairline cracks traced the walls, and the fractures glowed with a sickly phosphorescence. Through them came a sound that froze blood. Laughter. Not human laughter. Not anything that belonged to lungs and joy. It was the kind of amusement that arrives only when a predator realizes the cage door is open. The warp's denizens had noticed. I activated my personal link and reached for other astropaths across the system. 3 channels gave nothing but static. The 4th gave me screaming. Astropath Terminus Yellen, stationed aboard the defense platform, a vigilant guardian for half a century, finally cut through the interference. But her voice was no longer human in any meaningful sense. She spoke in a ragged braid of high Gothic, and something older than mankind's recorded tongue. Between the glossolalia, I caught fragments. Void shields fluctuating, weapon batteries firing at empty ranges, crew reporting hallucinations and spontaneous bleeding. The warp was leaking. I severed the connection and tried another. This time I reached Astropath Prime Hadrian aboard the Imperial Fist's Fortress Monastery. His voice was steadier than Yellen's, but the content of his words was worse. Cardor. Throne above, you're still transmitting. The chapter master has ordered a full withdrawal from the outer defenses. We're pulling back to the inner keep. Why? I managed. Because the walls are compromised, not by enemy action, by something else. The stone is changing, becoming unstable. Librarian Taurus attempted divination. It broke him. We restrained him after he started screaming about crawling dark and laughter inside the walls. If the Imperial Fists were abandoning outer lines on Terra, then conventional measures were already irrelevant. That fortress had endured sieges and heresies, 10 millennia of pressure without yielding so much as a pace. If it was retreating now, it meant the threat was not an army. It was the universe misbehaving. Hadrian asked for orders, as if my words could reassemble reality. I had none. The chain of command that had held the Imperium together had always assumed one immutable constant, the Emperor's presence. Without it, there was no unified empire, only isolated worlds, blind and alone, each facing the abyss with no guidance and no guarantee. "Hold as long as you can," I told him, hating the hollowness of the phrase. "And pray this isn't the end," the third tremor answered. Part of the sanctum ceiling collapsed, showering me with dust and ancient consecrated mortar. In the settling haze, I saw the far wall's crack widen, and through it seeped something that was not light and not shadow, an oily motion with purpose, sliding across the floor like liquid metal. Where it touched sanctified stone, the surface smoked and blistered as if holiness itself had become flammable. I drew my last pistol out of reflex, already knowing it was a child's gesture. The weapon's machine spirit was faltering, the power cell fluctuated, sacred programming struggling to remain coherent in a world unmoored from its god. Soon every gun, every engine, every void ship drive across the Imperium would suffer the same crisis. Not of mechanics, but of faith. The thing on the floor rose, smoke gaining anatomy. Horn shapes suggested themselves. Too many limbs, claws, eyes that did not belong to real space. It was the first of many, I knew. One opportunist tasting the gap where the wall had thinned. I closed my eyes and cast my senses outward again, daring to look farther than was safe. The galaxy was unraveling. Stable warp corridors, those old, dependable arteries of trade and war, were collapsing as chaos storms bloomed wherever the Emperor's pressure had once held. Ships in transit were being shredded by sudden turbulence. Navigators struck blind by the beacon's absence. Crews abandoned to madness in the howling nowhere between stars. On Macragge, the Ultramarines were mustering for a war they could not coordinate. Calls to arms would die unheard in psychic interference. They would fight because that is what they were made to do, but they would do it alone, cut off from brothers, cut off from command, cut off from the idea of an Imperium as anything more than memory. Mars was beginning to tear at itself. Tech priests confronted a reality in which the Omnissiah was no longer present to validate their cosmos. Machines that had functioned flawlessly for millennia seized and failed. Not because their components had worn down, but because their spirits could not accept what their world had become. Within days, the Red Planet would be a cemetery of silent engines and priests who died begging for answers that would never come. And the Eye of Terror, held in check for 10,000 years by will alone, was swelling. The great wound in reality gaped wider as the dark gods leaned in, unconstrained. Barriers split, cracks multiplied. Soon demons would not merely whisper from the edges. They would walk. I opened my eyes to find the entity nearly finished forming. It stood taller than a man, dense and opaque now, its chitinous hide reflecting colors that should not exist. Reality seemed to curve around it, as if physics had become optional in its presence. Its eyes were molten gold pits, beautiful in the way a furnace is beautiful. When it spoke, the voice carried a sound that made my stomach lurch. Children crying. Astropath, it murmured, as if tasting the word. Do you see? Do you understand what your god's ending has purchased? I do not speak with demons, I said, lifting the pistol with hands that refused steadiness. Its laughter sounded like glass fracturing. Then what have you done for a century? Every message you guided, every soul whisper you pushed through the warp, every prayer you mouthed to your corpse throne, filtered through our realm. We listened. We always listened. The pistol's machine spirit failed at last. The power cell died with a pathetic flicker. I let the weapon fall, its impact swallowed by the growing rumble of a mountain losing its integrity. What do you want? I asked, dreading the reply. It tilted its head, genuinely puzzled. Want? We require nothing. We have already won. The moment your god expired, the galaxy became ours. Every world that hid behind that light now belongs to the dark. We need only watch your species do the rest. Tear itself apart with grief, rage, hunger, and fear. More of the not light spilled through the widening cracks. Within, it moved shapes that defied geometry. Too many eyes, too few faces, angles that made the mind itch. My sanctum, my refuge, was becoming a mouth. I lurched toward the exit. The ancient blast door was sealed, its machine spirit either dead or gone mad. The control panel sparked as I touched it. Blessed oils within its circuits ignited in a brief, holy flare and then guttered out, leaving only dead metal. Where will you go? The demon asked, voice following like a chain. Your mountain crumbles, your empire burns, your god is gone. What sanctuary remains? The question sank deeper than any blade. For more than a century, my purpose had been simple. Serve as conduit, guardian, instrument. Without him, what was I? What was any of us? The Imperium had not only been an empire of ships and guns, it had been a faith made into infrastructure, a dream hammered into law and steel. Now the dream had fractured, and the truth beneath it was unbearably ordinary. A being had clung to life beyond all reason, and we had mistaken endurance for eternity. Humanity was alone again, like the age of strife, but worse, because this time we knew exactly what we had lost. The Vox network became a chorus of catastrophe. Terra's hive cities were in revolt. Arbits fought street wars in the underlevels, overwhelmed by masses whose belief had been ripped out of them in a single instant. Worse, some among the rioters showed signs of change. Flesh shifting in response to the warp's new proximity, mutation blooming like mold where hope had died. On Luna, Mechanicus gene labs spiraled into meltdown. Sacred genetic templates, those delicate patterns that had produced Astartes for millennia, began to degrade, corruption creeping into the lines. Even if the Imperium survived the immediate collapse, it might never again craft new angels of death. The existing chapters would fight their last wars with what bodies and bullets they already possessed. When they fell, there would be no replacements. Orbital defense platforms flickered. Void shields stuttered as machine spirits lost coherence. Weapon arrays went dark. If chaos struck at the Sol system now, they would find the cradle of mankind shockingly vulnerable. And the navigator houses, ancient bloodlines who had made warp travel possible, were dying. Without the Astronomican's guidance, their third eyes burned out under unfiltered turbulence. Within hours, every navigator in the Sol system would be blind, mad, or dead. And without navigators, no captain with sense would dare translate into the warp again. The Imperium's ability to cross the stars was ending, not gradually, but at once, like a severed nerve. A new voice cut through the chaos, familiar enough to chill me. Lord Commander Militant Drakan Van Gorich, speaking to Terra itself. "Citizens of the Imperium," he announced, calm layered over panic. "We face a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. The Emperor, may his name be blessed, has been grievously wounded, and his recovery is uncertain. Until he is restored, remain calm. Maintain your faith. Reports of his death are heretical propaganda and will be punished accordingly." A lie, transparent, fragile, necessary. If Terra learned the truth all at once, what remained of authority would collapse within hours. Better to pretend, to delay the detonation, to buy time. For what plan? There was no true contingency for the death of a god. The Imperium had been constructed on a single assumption, that the Emperor was an eternal constant. That assumption was gone, and with it went the architecture of everything. While the Vox droned, the demon solidified further, its presence now heavy enough to make the air feel crowded. It stepped closer, and the stone beneath it seemed to resent the contact. "Your lords lie to preserve order," it said, voice carrying certainty like iron. "But lies cannot outpace truth forever. Already the faithful doubt, already the weak seek new gods. We are patient, little astropath. We waited 10,000 years for this. We can wait a few hours more for your kind to accept what it has become." I thought then of the distant worlds, billions of lives built on the promise of a guiding light that had vanished without explanation. How long before they realized prayers were falling into silence? How long before despair hardened into rage? Before rage became heresy? Before the desperate began to bargain with anything that answered? On agri-worlds, governors would try to hold order as food servitors failed and harvest machines went mad. On forge worlds, priests would fracture into sects, some insisting the Omnissiah had transcended, others collapsing into nihilism, and the most dangerous turning hungry eyes toward forbidden disciplines. Hive worlds would descend into open warfare as nobles and gangs carved up the corpse of governance. And the Space Marines, those engineered paragons who had served as the Imperium's sword and shield, would face their own breaking. Some would hold fast, duty welded into their bones. Others, especially those already cracked by unstable gene seed or old doubts, would see the Emperor's end as proof that faith had always been a story told to keep them obedient. The civil wars to come would dwarf old legends of betrayal. The Horus heresy would look, in hindsight, like a small border fire compared to the inferno now waiting. Another tremor rolled through the mountain. This time I felt something inside my skull shift, an invisible fracture, the mind protesting the pressure of the warp leaning harder against the world. Above the rumble and the demon's quiet amusement, one truth remained, stark and unbearable. The light was gone, and the dark had been waiting. Blood began to run from my nose, then warm and sticky down the edges of my ears as the inner fortifications of my mind, raised brick by brick through decades of discipline, started to give way. The demon watched it happen like a physician observing an inevitable collapse. It bared a smile that was all wrong, revealing teeth that shone like black glass. "You feel it," it murmured, almost tender. "The truth's weight on your brittle sanity. You spent a lifetime pretending you could build walls strong enough to keep the universe out. Soon you'll accept what we have always understood." Its voice sharpened into something like doctrine. Order is theater. Law is a story. Only chaos endures. I tried to shut it out. I reached for the mental patterns that had carried me through a century of psychic strain. Breath counts that weren't breath, mantras that weren't words, the old geometries of calm I could once assemble as easily as blinking. But the techniques that had been instinct now felt like trying to grasp smoke with metal hands. Without the Emperor's presence, without that steady, impossible warmth that had anchored my soul, the warp was not merely loud. It was everywhere. I was unmoored in a storm, and the demon's voice had become the only consistent shape in the screaming wind. The cracks in the sanctum widened. More presences arrived. Not footsteps, not entrances. They simply were, sliding into reality through the fractures in stone and sanctity as if the world had developed pores. Some were strangely exquisite, forms too symmetrical, too perfect, like living sculpture built from forbidden mathematics. Others were grotesque in ways language refused to hold, limbs that implied pain just by existing, faces that weren't faces, angles that made my eyes sting and my thoughts stutter. All of them shared one common trait. They were wrong. Violations walking upright, natural laws made optional. Yet they stood there, solid, undeniable. Proof that the membranes between realms was splitting faster than any doctrine had prepared us to imagine. One of the newcomers moved like a shifting puzzle, its surface rearranging into patterns that hurt to look at directly. When it spoke, the sound didn't travel through air so much as appear inside my skull, bypassing hearing entirely. The great game begins anew. Its mind voice ground against my thoughts like stone on stone. For 10,000 years we were constrained, forced to bargain through mortal hands and whisper through temptation. That era is done. We act openly now. The galaxy will learn despair as a primary language. I wanted to argue, to deny, to spit out the creed like a blade. But what defense did I have left? The evidence was everywhere. Systems failing, psychic links collapsing, Terra's foundations trembling as if the planet itself was frightened. The creed of permanence had been revealed as a thin coat of paint over a rotting door. Soon, there would be demons in the avenues of the imperial capital, walking in plain sight, and the defenders, whatever still functioned, whatever still believed, would be asked to hold the sea back with their bare hands. The Vox grid began to stutter. Not from physical damage, but from spiritual collapse. The machine spirits that maintained the lattice finally buckling under the pressure of a reality that no longer made theological sense. Channels died one after another. Voices turned to static. Orders became half-words, then noise. The last message that came through with any clarity carried the timbre of a man refusing to grant the universe permission to win. It was Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, speaking from the battle barge, eternal crusader. Interference chewed at the edges of his words, but his resolve remained intact. "All loyal servants," he proclaimed, and I could hear the iron behind the distortion. "The system fractures, but we do not. We will not kneel to despair. The crusade does not end because the night has deepened. We go to war against mankind's enemies wherever they are found. The Emperor may be beyond reach, but his ideals are carried in what we do." He paused, only a breath, only a heartbeat, then drove the final nail in with a phrase older than most words. "The Emperor protects, even now." Then the transmission vanished, severed mid-sentence, leaving a hiss of dead air. I believed him. Helbrecht would keep his oath. The Black Templars would spend themselves down to the last heartbeat, turning their lives into a weapon simply because that was what they had chosen to be. But belief and outcome were not the same thing. What could a single chapter do against an Imperium that had decided to pour into the material like flood water through a broken dam? They would die as legends, yes. Bright, defiant sparks. And sparks do not reverse an ocean. The demon that had been toying with me straightened suddenly, as if hearing music no human ear could perceive. Its attention snapped toward something beyond the collapsing sanctum, beyond the mountain, beyond terror. When it spoke again, excitement vibrated through its voice like a blade humming. Ah, there it is. Its molten gold eyes widened with anticipation. "It begins. The first of the great workings is underway." Then, with a savoring cruelty, "Can you feel it, little astropath? 10,000 years of faith and fear, compressed, distilled, released all at once." I did feel it, a pressure rising in the warp that made everything I'd suffered so far seem like a child's illness. Somewhere out there, across the breadth of the galaxy, something vast was pushing toward manifestation, one of the great powers drawing breath in real space without restraint, no longer held back by will, by law, by physics, by anything resembling permission. The psychic shock of it rippled outward. Not a wave you could dodge, an inevitability that would touch every living mind, every dreaming animal, every sleeping child. Whatever madness we were enduring now would soon look, by comparison, like an orderly afternoon. The floor beneath me split with a sound like ancient bone breaking. The sanctum's stone, blessed, carved, sealed, could not bear the forces pressing through. The fissures widened, and through them reality began to show its underside. I saw other places. A battlefield under an alien sky where space marines fought knee-deep in shadows that wore teeth. A hive city burning beneath a heaven turned the color of old wounds. A forge wurst where priests tore at their own augmentations in frantic self-destruction, as if ripping out metal could rip out the truth. These weren't visions like the ones I had learned to interpret. Symbolic, distant, filtered. They were windows. All of it happening at once, everywhere, as if time had lost the authority to organize events into sequence. The Emperor's death hadn't simply ended a reign. It had punctured the fabric of cause and effect. Past and future began to bleed into the present like ink in water, and the concept of later started to feel naive. I tried to rise, to flee before the mountains swallowed the sanctum entirely, but my legs refused. The pressure drove me to my knees. My nervous system, enhanced and reinforced over decades, overloaded as sensory input poured in from across the galaxy. I heard worlds dying as if they were in the next room. I heard laughter that belonged to no throat shaped by nature. I heard prayers, countless, desperate, still flung upward by the faithful who hadn't yet grasped that their God could no longer answer. The demon watched me then with an expression that might almost have been pity. "Don't fight so hard," it said softly, almost kindly. "Your pain ends soon. When the change finishes, you'll see this was never an end. It's maturation. Childhood is over." Its voice lowered, coaxing. "It's time your species learns a more honest relationship with the universe." I wanted to spit at it, to curse it, to hate it so purely the hatred might become a weapon, but I could barely breathe. So instead, I reached for something older than rage. I remembered the oath. I remembered kneeling before the golden throne, eyes sacrificed to ritual fire, the scent of incense and sanctified oils thick in the air. I remembered the words I'd spoken, words that had defined my life more completely than my own name. "I will serve until my death. I will be a voice in the darkness." I will carry the light through the void. Those lines had held me together through every trial, every doubt, every psychic assault that tried to turn my mind inside out. Even now, especially now, when the Emperor was gone and the oath should have been meaningless, the cadence of it steadied me. Perhaps that was the difference between us and the things spilling through the cracks. Even when defeat was total, we could still choose what we would be. The demon sensed the shift. Its posture changed. Curiosity replaced amusement. How fascinating, it mused, head tilting. Even with proof of your god's mortality laid bare, you cling to belief. Tell me, little astropath, why? What is the point of faith in a thing that has failed you? It was not a cruel question. It was, in its own way, honest. And the question opened a wound I had never fully healed. The suffering committed in the Emperor's name, the billions ground into dust beneath the machine of survival, the cruelty sanctified by necessity. Why serve a system that devoured its own? Why continue to believe in a dream that demanded so much blood? I had never found a perfect answer, but I had continued anyway, because the alternative had always been worse, because surrendering to despair was simply another way of feeding the darkness. Because faith isn't a ledger, I heard myself say, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. It isn't a reward given only to what deserves it. It's a choice. It's deciding that things can be better, even when evidence says they won't. The Emperor may be gone, but what he stood for, what we tried to build, can survive if we carry it. The demon laughed, but not in mockery. It sounded almost entertained. And what will you carry forward? The orthodoxy that strangled innovation for millennia? The repression that turned worlds into graveyards? The hatred of the alien that kept you ignorant of anything outside your own fear? Each accusation landed hard because each held truth. The Imperium had never been clean. It had been a fortress built from compromises, a bulwark assembled out of brutal math. Survive first, repent later. It had traded virtue for endurance, mercy for longevity. And still, it was better than the alternatives, I said, though the words tasted bitter. Under it, humanity endured. We made art. We wrote histories. We built wonders. We reached for meaning even while the universe tried to grind us down. I swallowed, then forced the next part through. I'll carry what mattered. The belief that a human life has value. The refusal to yield completely to despair. The insistence that we can choose what we are, even when we cannot choose what happens to us. Something in the demon's form flickered. For a breath, it went translucent, and beneath the monstrous outline I glimpsed a suggestion of something else. Something that looked less like a predator and more like a prisoner wearing a predator's skin. You speak of hope, it said, and for the first time uncertainty threaded its voice. Hope is the cruelest joke. We have watched civilizations rise and fall across eons. Everyone convinced it would be different, everyone eventually crushed by forces beyond it. What makes you think your species is exempt? I had no certainty to offer. Entropy takes everything. Civilizations die, even stars end. Perhaps hope really was just a comforting lie designed to make the unbearable bearable. But if that was true, then your victory is empty too, I said, the thought unfolding as I spoke. If nothing matters, if all meaning is delusion, then it doesn't matter whether you win or we win. Chaos can destroy order, but it cannot build a meaningful replacement. You're not saving anything, you're just tearing it down faster. The demon wavered again, as if my words had struck a hidden joint. You understand more than most, it said quietly. That may be why you've lasted. Most mortals either break or submit. But you keep thinking, questioning, resisting even when resistance is pointless. It paused, then added, almost against its will, almost admirable. It should have meant nothing. Praise from corruption, a compliment from the abyss, and yet it felt like a small victory. If I could hold on to my mind, my choice, my humanity in this place, perhaps others could too. Perhaps somewhere in the galaxy there were men and women doing the same, standing in the ruins, deciding what they would be while everything else was being rewritten. The sanctum was barely a sanctum now. Shadows writhed across walls as if they were alive. Every blessed oil had burned out. The air shone with sick phosphorescence bleeding from the warp. But I was still here. Still me. The demon regarded me with something that approached respect. "You are stronger than I expected," it said. "Most have already drowned." "And you?" I asked, meeting its molten gaze. "If nothing matters, why speak to me? Why spend time on conversation with a dying mortal?" The question landed heavier than I intended. The demon's outline flickered. This time, the glimpse beneath the horror was clearer. The suggestion of a human soul trapped under layers of corruption, a memory of what it might have been before it learned the warp's languages. "Because," it began, and the words sounded almost like a confession. "In 10,000 years, you are the first to ask that. The first to imply my choices might be constrained too." Silence hung between us, an impossible bridge across an impossible gulf. In that moment, I understood a deeper horror of the warp. Not only that it was alien, but that it was built from impulses we recognized. Desire, fear, hunger, regret, magnified until they became gods. Then the mountain bucked again. This tremor was final. The remaining ceiling collapsed in a roar of stone and dust. Through the falling debris, I caught a slice of sky, and what I saw there destroyed something rational inside me. The stars were going out. Not dimming, not fading, simply ceasing, snuffed from reality one by one as spreading storms swallowed them. Familiar constellations, patterns that had guided humanity since its first steps into the dark, vanished as if erased. The demon followed my stare, almost reverent. "The last phase," it said. "With the beacon dead, the storms are no longer bound by place or rule. They will grow until they consume everything, star, world, matter, energy. In the end, only chaos, eternal, perfect." Another constellation died. Along with it went the light of countless suns, the homes of civilizations I had touched in spirit over my long service. Worlds that had once received my messages like lifelines. Gone, as if they had never existed. And still, in that hollowing despair, Helbrecht's voice returned to me. His refusal to surrender simply because surrender was logical. They had known they could not win. They chose to fight anyway. Not because victory was assured, but because resistance itself was a statement. A declaration that meaning can be chosen even when the universe offers none. Perhaps that had been the Emperor's true legacy all along. Not divinity, not salvation, but the symbol of refusal. The stubborn human impulse to stand against darkness even when the odds are absurd. I turned back to the demon as the world around us fell apart. "You're wrong about one thing," I said, shouting above the thunder of collapsing stone. "This isn't just an ending." Its eyes narrowed, curious. "What then?" "It's a choice," I said. "The choice to remain human, even if humanity is dying. The choice to hold to principles even when they offer no practical advantage. The choice to carry something greater than survival." The demon's laughter returned, but it sounded different now, threaded with something like sorrow. "And what will that accomplish? The stars will still die. The storms will still spread. Your species will still end." "Maybe nothing," I admitted. "Maybe everything. Maybe others are making the same choice elsewhere. Maybe the light we followed was never only a beacon in the warp, but the decision of billions not to yield completely to despair." The demon's form trembled, thinning at the edges as if it were losing cohesion in the collapsing reality. For an instant, I saw the truth of it. Something that had once been mortal, that had once stood where I stood, and had made a different choice. "I remember choosing," it said softly, voice almost human for the first time. "Long ago, before the warp remade me. I wonder what might have changed if I had held to it longer." Then it dissolved, unraveled into the malignant air like mist pulled apart by wind. I was alone in the ruin. I could have stayed there. Let the stone bury me. Let the end come without witnesses. But that would have been surrender. So I began to climb, through shattered passages, collapsed shafts, emergency routes that had once been orderly and now were jagged wounds. It took time, measured not in minutes, but in will. When I finally dragged myself into open air, Terra's transformation was already well underway. The sky had turned the color of old blood, veined with sick green light that pulsed as if the heavens had developed a heartbeat of their own. In the distance, hive spires burned, adamantine cracking, architecture failing under forces it had never been designed to endure. And I was not alone. On the mountain's plateau stood a small scatter of survivors, perhaps a dozen, some in the robes of the Adeptus Astronomica, others in battered guard armor, others in the plain clothing of palace servitors. Every face carried the same expression, the stunned emptiness of people who have watched their universe collapse and are still waiting for it to be reversed. A young woman stepped forward, astropathic tattoos still fresh and dark against her pale skin. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her voice held steady. "Prime," she said. "What are your orders?" For a moment, the question nearly broke me. Orders, in the face of a galaxy coming apart? Then I understood what she was really asking. Not for a solution, not for reassurance, for continuity, for direction, for proof that even in ruin, we could still choose structure over panic. "We survive," I said, and the words came easier than they should have. "We bear witness. We remember what was, and we preserve what we can of what should be." It wasn't much. It might not even qualify as a plan, but it was something to hold with both hands while everything else fell away. One by one, the others nodded. In their eyes I saw a familiar flame, small, stubborn, defiant. We were a handful of broken souls on a dying world, standing in the shadow of a dead dream. But we were still human, still capable of choice, and that was not nothing. As the sky continued to rot overhead and the distant city burned below, we began the long work of witnessing, of becoming the memory of what humanity had been, and the proof that it had existed at all. Then the wind shifted, carrying ash and the stink of burning hab blocks, and beneath it, something else. Voices. Human voices, raised not in panic, but in song. From somewhere in the dying hive, a chorus rose, old hymns, ancient words, ragged but resolute. Faint at first, then stronger, repeated as if repetition itself could become armor. "The Emperor protects," they sang. "He did not. He could not anymore," they sang anyway. And in that refusal to stop, this stubborn insistence on meaning in the teeth of annihilation, I felt, for the first time since the silence began, something like warmth, not the beacon, not a god's touch, something smaller, more fragile, and in its own way more real, the human decision to endure. When the hymn faded, silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, expectant, as if the universe itself were waiting to see what we would do with the last scraps of time. We chose to endure. We chose to remember. We chose to remain human, whatever the cost. The Emperor was dead. The Imperium was dying. But the idea, the defiance, the refusal, still lived wherever a human voice rose against the dark. And in that sense, the demon had been wrong. This was not only an ending. It was the beginning of what we chose to be without a light to follow.